Okay, so we will get started. Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. My name is Nikki Oxall and I am the research coordinator at the PFLA, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Lisa Norton, who has been leading the SEEGSLIP project. And this afternoon's webinar session is all about hearing what the results from that are, to understand what the findings have been, but also to have a discussion about how that would be useful for PFLA farmers and members and what the next steps are with this information. We are recording the session this afternoon. And like I said, if you could just make sure that you are on mute so that we don't have any interference with the sound quality, that would be great. And I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who's going to talk to us about the SEEGSLIP project, which was to evaluate the agronomic and social impacts of Pasture for Life certified approaches to grazing management. Lisa, thanks ever so much. I will pass over to you.
Hi, thanks, Nikki. Nice to see some familiar faces. Okay, I'm going to get the slideshow going. Can everybody see that? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to apologise in advance because it's quite a long, there's quite a lot of results here, but I wanted you to see all of the different areas that we've worked in, because I really would value feedback on how we get these results out to people and in what kind of format. So yeah, Nikki's already introduced the project with a very large title. I would just say that it's funded by the Global Food Security Programme, which is a UK research council programme. So various research councils put into the pot to fund it. And the project involves researchers from a whole range of organisations at the bottom there. So Lawrence, he's here, I can see him. He started off at the Organic Research Centre and he's now at Reading. Yeah, others are from Lancaster University and SRUC, and all the other acronyms, etc. at the bottom there have all been usefully involved. And I can see that Paul Muto's there from Natural England, who's also been helping us with the project. So in I go. Let me just, we didn't check how to move it on, did we, Nikki? That was the one thing we didn't do. Let me go there. Right. So that was my short title, Evidencing PFLA Practices from Multiple Perspectives. So what did we find? So initially, I just thought I'd characterize the farms. So in year one, we had 2 years of field work. In year one, we looked at 56 farms. About half of them were actually certified PFLA producers, and the other half were members only or getting towards certification. Most of the farms were lowland, so max altitude 400 meters there. Most were beef and sheep. Some described themselves as mixed, some were mainly arable with some beef, and then sheep and dairy. And the sizes ranged enormously from just 6 hectares to 1,228 hectares at the other end. We also classified them a bit on grazing styles because that was something we were interested in looking at. And about 30% said they were set stocked. And you can see that the remainder of them were sort of mob grazed or paddock grazed or strip grazed or other, which was sort of mixed grazing. So in the second year of fieldwork, we covered just 17 farms, and that was because we were looking at particular practices, and 15 of those farms were from the original sample and 2 were new PFLA farms. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to cover is the soils and vegetation work. I think some of you might have heard it before, so we won't dwell on this one for a long time. That's the 56 farms. That's me actually doing some proper work. There's a vegetation quadrat and there's a soil core. So what we did, this says ecological condition of PFLA in pasture in context. And the context was a national context and data from the Countryside Survey. And the Countryside Survey is a big sample of squares, 1 kilometre squares, which you can see in the map of England, of Britain, and 950 grassland plots are covered by that survey. And so the first result of significance was that 80% of the sampled grasslands were categorized as neutral grassland. So there's various different grassland types, but the most predominant ones in the UK and GB are neutral or improved grassland. And improved means agriculturally improved. So they're fertilized and used relatively intensively. So the first result is that PFLA grassland tended not to be that improved grassland, it tended to be neutral. Then if we start looking at the charts, the top left, the total species richness, there's a red star under CS improved, and that means that that bar is different to the other two. Okay, so total species richness between neutral and PFLA grassland was pretty similar, but they were both different to and higher than the species richness you typically get in an improved grassland. And similarly for forb richness. So forbs are everything except the grasses, essentially, and you get a very similar result. So CS improved doesn't have a lot of those, but the other two types of grassland do. The third sort of vegetation result that was of significance is that vegetation height, so the height of the grass or forbs, was significantly bigger in the PFLA plots than it was in either the CS improved grasslands or the neutral grassland plots. So grassland on PFLA farms is high. It's unusually high, and that's quite a significant finding because tall grass is really important for biodiversity of all sorts, invertebrates, particularly invertebrates, but anything that hunts on invertebrates, bird species, or for small mammals as well, and anything that hunts on small mammals. So that's quite a significant result. The second two charts show soil parameters. So on the bottom left is carbon concentration, and you'll see that there the red star is under the neutral grassland bar, and that's because that's the one that's different to the other two. So CS improved and PFLA were not different from one another. So soil carbon was actually it's a bit higher on neutral grassland. It's not a whole lot higher. It's a bit higher on neutral grassland than it is on CS improved grassland or on PFLA grassland. The bottom right is soil phosphorus. So again, the star is under the CS neutral. CS neutral has lower soil phosphorus than either improved grassland or PFLA grassland. Now that one's a bit counterintuitive because if you look at it, the PFLA looks pretty much as low as CS neutral. And actually it is, the actual number is, but there's no significance there. And we think that's because it's a much smaller sample. As I said, there's 950 grassland plots between improved and neutral grassland. And sometimes having a bigger number means you're more likely to get a statistically robust result. So soil P is low on PFLA, but it's not significantly different from improved grassland. Okay. This is a table which just is just what we use the CS grassland data because it's a very big data set, and that means that you can get good results, significant results out of it. And what I wanted to know from that data set was whether there are any relationships between the above ground vegetation and what you get below ground. So this table shows the vegetation metrics on the right and the soil metrics on the left. And what we're looking for is relationships between those metrics. So if you look under ryegrass cover, there's a green arrow going up, and that basically shows that where soil P is going up, ryegrass cover is often going up. So it's not a surprising relationship, it's that you're getting fertilizer and ryegrass cover on the same swards. It's a positive relationship. All the rest of those relationships with increasing ryegrass cover are negative. So you're going to get lower soil P, lower soil moisture and lower numbers of beasts in soil where you've got a higher ryegrass cover. Okay, in the right-hand column, that's species richness of the vegetation. So you've got a red arrow going down, which means that your species richness is negatively associated with increased soil P. So the higher your soil P, the lower your species richness. In contrast, the other three are green. So if you've got a good species-rich sward, you're going to have higher soil carbon, higher soil moisture, and higher total taxa in your soil. That's what we found in the CS results. So they were all significant relationships. So I think the take-home message from the soils and vegetation work is that neutral grassland is more ecologically sustainable than improved grassland. We can see that from that above, and that PFLA grassland doesn't yet have all the qualities of neutral grassland, but it's likely to be on the way. Okay, other soil vegetation results. These are just some of the others that have been pulled out within some of the publications that we're preparing. So legume cover, that's plants that fix nitrogen like clovers, was significantly lower in pastures greater than 20 to 50 years. So greater than 20 to 50 years means that it's that length of time since they've been ploughed, essentially. So legume cover was lower in those pastures than it was in pastures that are less than 10 years of age. So if they have been ploughed in the last 10 years, they tended to have more legumes, which is probably because they've been sown. And a lot of the newly sown legumes are not very persistent in seed mixtures. So that's not a particularly surprising result. Species richness and butterfly food species. So we actually look at what the species are and we know which ones are butterfly food species, whether they're for caterpillars or as pollen sources. They were significantly higher in the pastures where there'd been no ploughing for, sorry, can you see that? No ploughing for more than 100 years. So the mean bulk density of PFLA improved grassland samples. So bulk density is how squashed up your soil is, essentially. So it's higher in the PFLA samples. That was significantly higher in improved grassland than it was in the neutral grassland samples that we had. As I said, most of the samples were neutral grassland, but where we had improved grassland in the PFLA sites, that's where the bulk density was high. And in the opposite sense, soil organic matter was higher in the neutral grassland than it was in the improved grassland, which is not, those things go together. The last couple of things are, we're moving on to the microbial richness in a minute, but there were no significant trends with pasture age, so how long since plough, in terms of soil organic matter, soil phosphorus, or the cover of the ryegrass, the Lolium peren, or microbial richness. And on average, fungal richness, that's soil fungi, was lower in the oldest fields. Okay. So we're going on to microbial richness now. There's a few slides. They're quite complicated. I'll try and be as straightforward as I can. So how did the microbia in the soil respond to management practices? So these two figures show differences in bacterial on the left, bacterial community composition, and fungal community composition on the right. Related to pasture age, again, that being how long since the pasture had been ploughed. So if you look at the one on the left, they're a bit mixed up, all those dots. If you look at the one at the right, there's a couple of groups that separate out. And the group in the top left, the black dots with the blue circle, they are fungi. That's a fungal community of fields that are less than 10 years since they've been ploughed. Those green spots in the red circle are fields that have not been ploughed for more than 50 years. So we can just see that there's a different assemblage of fungi. That's about all we can tell from the data we've got. It's different community. The grazing type didn't influence the microbial communities. And we found that fertilizer application reduced the variation in the fungal communities, but that's all we can tell from the data we have. So other microbial data, so responses to management practices or to soil variables. So this is absolutely the thing that all soil microbial scientists say. Soil pH is the strongest predictor of bacterial and fungal community composition. It always is. So on those charts, if you look, the axis along the bottom separates those colors out all the way from the dark purple on the left to the sort of orangey yellow on the right. And that's basically pH. So pH 7, 8 towards the left-hand end, all the way down to probably 5 at the right-hand end. So that is the single most important variable influencing those communities. So fungal richness increased with soil pH, but it didn't show any relationship with plant richness or soil organic matter. Bacterial richness decreased with soil pH and increased with both plant richness and soil organic matter. Okay, another one, another one. So this one is looking at, so Fiona, who did this analysis, did an excellent job. She looked at responses of the microbial soil things, the microbia in the soil, to vegetation, soil and management factors. And so these sort of bar charts, so the proportion of the variation in the bacterial and the fungal communities, which is explained by different variables. So the big bit is grey, and that's soil chemistry. The second biggest bit is blue, and that's a mixture of plant community and soil chemistry. So those are the two predominant things, interactions between plant community and soil chemistry, and soil chemistry were the big factors influencing soil microbia. There are other factors in there. The farm was in there, so there was a very minor effect of farm, and that was in terms of organic status, pasteurization, but they were the key farm variables that we looked at. But as you'll see there, the little orange strip over there. So yeah, so again, it's soil chemistry and plant community interactions that are the key thing. Right, these are really difficult to understand, so I'm not going to expect you to. All I want you to know is that they're different to one another. Okay, so the one on the left is the bacteria, the one on the right is the fungi. The numbers are actually much higher with bacteria. There are a lot more bacteria species, as it were, than there are fungi species. But there's a lot more fungal interactions there. So all those little tail of little bars to the right and all those joining up lines underneath just show that there are many more fungi than bacteria responded to multiple drivers within the farms in the indicator analysis. So we can see that the fungi are responding to plant and soil chemistry particularly. Okay, last microbial one. So Fiona looked to see if particular groups of fungi were responding to particular factors. And we only picked out one strong relationship. So most of those lines are not showing a significant direction away from flat. And the one that is the, I'm going to have trouble saying it, agaricomycetes. Mycetes, I think it's called, and they were positively associated with loss on ignition. That's what LOI stands for, and that's soil carbon. It's basically the vegetation fraction of the soil that you can burn off in an oven. And those, the agaricomycetes, are mushroom-forming fungi. So they're the ones that seem to be influenced by LOI in the soil. So overall, just to conclude that microbial work, what we found is that those interactions between plant community and soil chemistry were very important in determining the microbial community structure. And we note there that it's important to consider the history because we know that the vegetation communities often take a long time to shift in response to practices. And so there may be lags in the system that we are picking up as well as actual results of what's happening now. Okay, public goods tool. Some of you will have suffered filling in the interview for the public goods tool, and I'm just going to give you some results from that now. So one of the things we did was an economic analysis, and some of you will know that we used the results to benchmark the PFLA practices. And those results sort of overall showed that PFLA farmers were often outperforming the farm business survey sample, which I'll show you in a minute. And we think the key reasons are two. So one is that there's more direct selling, so less processing and marketing. For example, in the farms covered in the second year of the survey, the 17 farms, 7 of them had farm shops. The other reason is that there's less inputs going in, so less costs essentially. So here we go. These are the figures for the beef sucklers, and the figures on the left in blue are the PFLA figures. And there's a bar for all on the far left, and then there's bottom, middle third, and top third. And the Farm Business Survey figures are on the right, and you can see those yellow bars are all lower. That's the gross margin per suckler cow. In terms of output and variable costs per suckler cow, the dark blue bar is the output, and the variable costs are the smaller, lighter blue bar. And you can see that the output costs, the outputs are much higher there than they are on the right for the Farm Business Survey sample of lowland and upland sucklers. There's a lovely photo of my colleague Marcus, who did a lot of the PG tool data collection there too. So in terms of sheep were much more similar to the Farm Business Survey. Again, PFLA in blue, Farm Business Survey in yellow, and here in green we've got some organic samples. And you can see that they're much more similar. What was notable perhaps from this one is that for the sheep, the variable costs are very low for the PFLA farmers compared to the Farm Business Survey and the organic. So the PG tool, for those of you who did it, you'll know that it looks like this. This is what farmers get to see, hopefully, at the interview if they were very lucky, or after the interview, to show how their farm did along 11 different axes. You can see the names of the axes: landscape and heritage, fertilizer management, etc. So there's 3 lines drawn on this diagram. The blue line is the average score for farms in of the 56 farm. I think it was probably 54 farms that filled in the tool. The grey line on the outside shows the highest score on each axis for any farm. So that's not all the scores from one farm, they're from any of the farms. And similarly for the orange line, the lowest scores that we got on each of those axes. So in general, the average is looking pretty good. I think it's mostly around the 3 to 4 mark, showing good public goods delivery. There are 1 or 2 where it falls back, and agricultural systems diversity, it's kind of an inevitability because we were looking at beef and sheep systems, and that score is all about how many different enterprises you have on the farm. So this tool we have collected a lot of data with this tool, but it is primarily a tool to do with farmers, to help them see the many different areas that their farm affects, and also to, encourage them to think about ways of improving performance. The scoring data was difficult to handle for us. And we tried to use the scoring data. Lawrence and Alistair and I worked on this, and we decided that it wasn't really a legitimate thing to do in terms of an analysis for publication, and therefore we decided we would go back to largely the raw data, and that's what we did. And this is one of the methods that Lawrence particularly worked on to try and present the data. And I think one of the really important things to know is the numbers on the right hand side are all the different farms. Each line is a different farm. And this particular analysis package tries to pull out groups of farms where they're relatively similar to one another. But if you look at the sort of bracketed, the blue bracket, what it shows you is that down that axis, all of the farms are different. They're all different to one another. There's no 2 farms that are similar. And I think that's one of the key issues for us as natural scientists, particularly. Each farm is completely different to one another. That makes it very difficult to come out with broad, sensible messages about how different factors vary on farms because of this complexity. However, I'm going to try and show you some patterns that we think we picked up. So here you'll see the costs on the left, the green shading down the bottom of that column, is associated, we think, with lighter shading down the bottom of the gross margin column. Okay, so that's one of the patterns we picked out from here. Another pattern is that if you look at the loss on ignition, which is the carbon in the soil, that seems to be associated with higher values in the vegetation columns. So that's the form richness, species richness and grass height columns, but also with the years of being a PFLA members. There's obviously some anomalies further down those columns, but in general, the darker green colours are at the top of those columns, which just shows that there are probably some patterns in there. Okay, so there were also interviews by a social scientist, and these are some of the messages that Claire Waterton pulled out from those interviews. And she found that PFLA farmers felt that the farmers, not the government, were leading the way for them, that the realities of the diversity of beef farming were really evident to those farmers, that it is really complex and that is not reflected in the media. She felt that farmers are feeling changes in themselves, how they farm, what they pay attention to when they're farming and what their role is in society. She felt that the PFLA farmers were going through a process of decapitalisation of farming, so much less emphasis on infrastructure and subsidy and keeping things much simpler for themselves. She found that the farmers that she interviewed were very positive, very proactive and creative in terms of finding solutions that work for them and their businesses, that they were learning from one another and enjoying support from one another, from things like the Google Forum, the local meetings, the Groundswell, the Oxford Real Farming Conference and national and international meetings. And she found that farmers were thinking about the importance of other structures for them, including marketing, supply chain things, certification, abattoir networks, and they were also thinking together about media focuses on meat, etc. So this social perspective is something that will come into our publications and our reporting because it's a very important aspect of the systems. So Claire sort of summarised that farmers are learning and acting and not necessarily waiting for policy support. And she pulled out a particular quote that she felt was very representative. So I'll just give you a minute to read that yourselves. Okay, hopefully you'll read as quick as me. Okay, so a few more bits to show you. So fuzzy cognitive mapping, that sounds horrendous. And indeed, when you see the next picture, you'll think it is. Okay, so this is a mind map, and this was produced by a PFLA group, the PFLA research group, mapping the system from their perspective. And you'll see some really strong blobs saying vegetation quality, vegetation quantity, grass use efficiency and soil health, really core parts of the system, interconnected with lots of other parameters. This next picture is one generated by stakeholders from the beef industry, and they produce slightly more blobs, not loads more, slightly more, but very strongly interconnected. And the big blobs on this one are a little bit different. Some of them are the same, but the amount of imported feed, extent of environmental regulation, production efficiency, ability to meet climate change targets, price per kilo, all quite big blobs on this one. And the process of doing this mapping was, one, to see how the system was perceived differently by those within it or looking at it. But we also asked this group from the beef industry to make some predictions about what would happen if we moved to a pasture-fed livestock system. And the results of that exercise were that from their perspective, this is what they perceived to be the changes likely to happen, were that there would be increases in subsidies for beef farmers, decreases in production efficiency, decreases therefore in the ability to export produce. Just noted that in the UK in 2019 we exported 9% of beef produced. And also decreases in the proportion of feed currently fed to cattle from non-human edible sources. So maybe that making that food therefore available perhaps for other monogastric livestock. Okay, so that was their predictions of what they think would happen, which is something we'll be writing up. I'm moving on again quickly because there's lots of bits of research. There was a consumer analysis done by Claire Waterton, and I sat in on some of these. She did 6 groups, 2 with young flexitarians, 2 with supermarket consumers, 2 with people who buy their meat directly from the PFLA. And basically we talked to them about shopping habits, eating habits, what they look at, what labels have meaning, etc. And this is the one slide summarizing this exercise. And it just showed that consumers are really caught up with very many issues when they buy food. And they're certainly not thinking just about ecological sustainability or nutritional value. They're thinking about very many other things. Things like how quick can they cook it, where can they get it from easily, those kind of things. But she did show that all of the groups were actually experimenting with their eating habitats. Many of them were thinking about eating less meat, and they weren't necessarily thinking about being discriminated about what meat it was, but they were thinking about eating less. 4 of the 6 groups, unsurprisingly, the 2 that buy directly from PFLA were aware of it, but for the other 4 groups, not at all aware. But there was also a general lack of awareness on labelling. A lot of them had never seen organic labels, red tractor, even the free range one, didn't know what they meant, never seen them. But Claire also did find that despite this lack of awareness, consumers do understand that the food system has very powerful force for change, not just in food and health, but in agriculture and the environment. Okay, the last bit, I think is the last bit, is just a brief bit on the practice of mob grazing, which is something we looked at in the second year. So ideally, we would have collected data which showed us exactly how mob grazing affects soil and vegetation characteristics. But this is really actually very difficult to do. I think I'll explain a bit more in a minute on that. But what we ended up doing was actually classifying what is mob grazing, what do people think is mob grazing, because many farmers said they were doing it, but we found that lots of them were doing it very differently. So we ended up classifying it on these variables, so numbers of summer grazings, length of grazings, livestock units per hectare, and how long they were resting the grass. And we found that the fields we looked at fell into 4 groups. So the first group, not largely different from just rotational grazing, so rotational non-mob stocking. The second group, rotational mob stocking, so bigger groups but moving them around reasonably frequently. And then we had a set of fields that we felt did classify as mob grazing in a more traditional sense, like the Americans do it, but only 2 fields that we really classified as intensive mob grazing, similar to what's being advocated in North America. So just the 2 fields, both same farmer. So only 1 farmer was intensively mob grazing. Several farmers were on a mob grazing journey of experimenting and learning about what might work in their system. They all talked about the need to overcome constraints in terms of water availability, fencing, sometimes shade, and farmers often supported by networks, just local ones with their mates who are having a go, or more innovative farmer groups like the Tallgrass Grazing Group in southern Scotland. We did find that long-term data was useful for indicating potential effects. And so this particular example is from the one, which was very lucky for us, the one intensively mob grazing farmer, the single one. We happen to have a countryside survey plot on his land and on the actual field that we sampled for mob grazing. So this farmer the countryside survey, which I showed you the results for earlier on, is a survey that's happened since 1978. So we have data from 1978 on that farm, also from 98, 2007, and now from 2018. So the farmer hasn't been there all the time, but we know exactly when he got there and what he's been doing since he's got there. We use exactly the same vegetation and soil protocols as used in CS. So we can show the pink line is where he started mob grazing. So you can see on that that's the LOI, the soil carbon, and the total mineralizable carbon in the total carbon in the mineral fraction of the soil have both gone up since he's mob grazing. So the bars to the right of the pink line. And also, if you look at the right-hand graph, soil nitrogen, that's the 2018 one, has also gone up. So there's been an increase in soil carbon and soil nitrogen. There was a decrease in soil phosphorus because he doesn't apply fertilizer, and a decrease in pH, so he hasn't been applying lime. There's also a decrease in species richness. Okay, so that mob grazing doesn't support high richness, that intensive mob grazing, and a big change in species dominance. So in that field, it used to be very ryegrass dominated, and it's not now. It's dominated by bent, a species of bent. So that's just one field, and that we have long-term data for. We don't know how typical that is of mob grazing practices, but it is at least some data. So quite interesting to do. And this is that farmer. This is a picture of one of his fields with his cows closely together, and you can read how much he enjoys doing this mob grazing, and setting his fences so that they automatic release and watching the cows move through. So just finally to say that we do have soils from this year, the mob grazing work, which we are yet to analyse in detail. And I'm sorry to farmers who are waiting for results for those years, but we still don't really understand what those results are telling us. And we want to keep looking at them for a bit longer. We know that our attempt to find contrasting fields was ineffective. We were trying to do paired samples, but it didn't really work that way. And we also know that many farmers, it was very recent, their changes in practices, and that means we're not really picking up anything quickly. So that was just to say you made it through the talk, and a big thanks to, obviously, so this is a massive team work event. Lots of people, all those people there and others have made it possible to do the work. And finally, I just wanted to show, I want to ask the question, how do we disseminate all this and to who? But these are the scientific papers coming out of this work, or so the first two are currently under review. The third, fourth, fifth, are all in advanced drafts, or nearly. One of them needs a bit more work. The sixth is also in draft, a reasonably advanced draft, and the seventh is also in an advanced draft, actually. The last two, we will need a lot of work yet, but we do hope to get those out. Particularly the last one is really about how the challenge of doing science on real farming systems. But so I want to ask the question, how do we disseminate all this and to who? But that's my last slide. I don't know if you want me to leave that one there or not, Nikki. What do you think?
Maybe we'll have some questions first and we could possibly come back to it. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Lisa, thank you so much. And whilst you're just sorting out your screen, would really like to ask if anyone has any questions, then to pop them in the chat and we can pick those up as we go through. I've got a couple of questions which I'd like to start with, if that's okay, Lisa. You still got Lisa? Is Lisa frozen for everybody else as well? I think we may have just lost Lisa. So I think whilst we just maybe wait for Lisa to reconnect, we do have some others. So I might just put the spotlight on you, Lawrence, actually, if that's okay, because I know that you're here, and would be really interested to know if there's any other reflections, particularly on the public goods tool work that you undertook. I think what I was really interested in is that same tool was used to compare or to analyse Scottish upland farms recently. I think Davy McCracken was leading on that work at SIUC. And I was thinking it'd be really interesting to make comparisons between what you guys found from PFLA farms and what was found in the Scottish upland context, and if there's any anything that we can take from that. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to know if you had any thoughts, additional thoughts from what Lisa was telling us.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki, and hi everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. The sound all right, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So yeah, from the PG tool work. Yeah. I think one of the things that I noticed from that the heat map that Lisa showed earlier, and that's the this image here. I just can you see that on my screen again?
Yeah, that's great.
Is that working? Yeah. So thanks. Yeah. So as Lisa mentioned earlier, one of the key things that we took from this was that every farm that's represented by this number on the far right here is very different in terms of the darkness of these rectangles, or the color of the rectangles across the x-axis being quite different across the whole sample. But one of the things that we noticed as well from looking at this heat map was that there were quite high values for this group of farms that are represented down here at the bottom left in the costs area. So this is sort of variable costs, which includes things like sort of purchased fertilizer and purchased feeds coming into the farm gate. But at the same time, we were seeing that these farms tended to be on the lower end of the PFLA membership, which is this MEM 9 category here. So so as Lisa was saying, the darker the value, the darker the color on the heat map. So this that was quite an interesting thing I thought that came out from the PG tool data that we put in to these heat maps. And yeah, as Lisa mentioned, the relationship there between the sort of species richness and the LOI, which is the related to the soil carbon, and the relationship between species richness and forest coverage that you'd expect to see. So that was but yeah, that was quite interesting for me, I think, looking at this relationship between the higher costs and the lower PFLA membership years. So essentially saying that the younger members had higher costs within the sample. So that was quite interesting. And the PFLA scores themselves within the PG tool, they this image that Lisa showed it shows the mean in dark blue, and then the range across the farms. So the lowest score out of all of the 56, and the highest score out of all of the 56 for each of the 11 categories. And so you can see from this that there were some areas that were more consistent than others in terms of having a less variable scores across. So the ranges were less vast for things like the farm business resilience in particular, and then for the agricultural systems diversity and the extent of agro-environmental management, which relates to participation in schemes, we were seeing quite substantial variation across the piece. So there were some producers who were very much engaged with agro-environment schemes and others who weren't, and then similarly some producers that were very diverse in terms of the number of enterprises, and others who weren't, who were sort of more specialized. But yeah, as Lisa said, the overall picture was pretty good in terms of the scores generally being at sort of 3 or greater across the piece. Yeah, I'll yeah, as far as results is concerned, yeah, I'm actually talking to the results team about just that in terms of whether we can integrate the two data sets somehow, because well, there's the scores themselves, of course, but then there's also the underlying data that's represented here in this heat map that for things like the costs and the gross margin, membership years, and so on. So I think there would be scope for combining those in the near future.
Lawrence, thank you so much for jumping in at the last second.
Sorry.
You even had slides prepared just in case. I think that was fantastic. I can see that Lisa has rejoined us, and there's a couple of questions that have been asked. So I might just pop Lisa back on spotlight if that's okay. But Lawrence, thank you so much, and Lisa, glad to see that you made it back.
Sorry about that. Just totally
glitch.
He just went.
No worries.
Switched off.
So there was a question in the chat from Martin, who says, am I right in reaching the takeaway from Lisa's data that the grazing strategy has much less impact on soil carbon, species richness, biodiversity than simply sticking to pasture only?
That's a difficult one. On soil carbon, can you just say that again? Because I mean, I don't think.
Sure. Yes.
Is it the influence on greenhouse gases or the influence on? Go on.
I'm wondering, Martin, if you want to ask the question yourself to clarify, then you're welcome to unmute and ask, if that's helpful.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Lisa. Thanks very much. Pretty challenging, informative presentation. Thank you. Towards the end, you went into the various different MOB strategies, and they seemed, the takeaway that I got was, or the overriding impression I got was that how you were grazing had less effect on all the things you were measuring, whether it was soil carbon, whether it was species richness, etc. Even in fact, mob grazing made the species richness worse than the fact that you weren't putting other inputs in. You were sticking on a PFLA type diet for the beef. Is that a fair takeaway, or did I sort of kind of jump to the wrong conclusion?
No, I think it definitely makes a difference if you're not using fertilizers and you're not feeding concentrates. Makes a big difference to certain things. So concentrates come out of the end of cows in the form of phosphates. So if you're putting fertilizer on or you're feeding concentrates, your phosphates are going to be high on your farm. So I think that's a definite. But I think into the mob grazing, I think our problem was that most farmers are doing it only very recently. So I just don't think the evidence is there yet. So I'm not saying that I don't think it does enhance carbon, because I think if anything, the single farm where we have got historical data does seem to indicate that it may well enhance soil carbon. But you may have to do it pretty intensively to get that, or to get that response in a time scale that's easy to, or relatively easy to measure. I think that's one of the issues, is that things may be taking a lot longer than we'd hope. But we do also know that neutral grassland is not that much more carbon rich than improved grassland. I mean, we know that from the countryside survey sample. So yeah, I mean, but most of that neutral grassland is not intensively grazed or mob grazed in the way that one farm is. So I think nothing's ever simple, is it, unfortunately, in science. But I do think there probably is a trade-off between carbon and biodiversity, above ground biodiversity, because I think if you're choosing to manage your cattle in an intensive way, whether that be with inputs or without inputs, you're going to have a knock-on effect on something. And I think probably biodiversity is going to be a knock-on effect of intensive grazing, because though grazing is really important for biodiversity and conservation, grazers are vital. Conservation grazing is very light compared to the level of mob grazing that particular farmer is implementing.
Great, thanks.
So.
Thanks, Martin, and thank you, Lisa, for the clarity. There was a question from Hannah Davis, which is, what are the research questions you would like further explored? And I'm wondering, Hannah, if you're asking everybody, and if so, we'll all probably just pile in with a list of things that we would like to have researched. Or do you want to just clarify that, Hannah?
Yeah, everyone pile in. Let us know.
And just for those of you who may not be aware, Hannah has been working with the PFLA on SUSCAT, which was another research project that you can hear about if you want to find the recordings for that. They're probably available on the PFLA YouTube channel. There's another question of, did you measure soil bulk density in order to get a fair comparison for soil organic carbon?
Yeah, we did really, because soil bulk density makes a difference to soil carbon measurements, because obviously how compact your soil is affects your amount of carbon. So yeah, I mean, that might be one of the reasons why your soil samples containing looser soil may have lower carbon, because the actual amount of soil is less. So yeah, it is a way of ensuring that you're having a comparable sample. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa.
Is that all right, Paul, or is that a bit vague?
No, that's fine. I was just wondering if you were including soil bulk density in your analysis.
Yeah, we did where possible. Yeah, where we had it. So in the last year, we decided to use some augured samples. I will say that, and that's tricky because you alter the bulk density by auguring. Especially if you've got a relatively narrow auger and you're forcing it down to 30 centimeters, that's what we wanted, to go a bit deeper to see if soil carbon was going down deeper into the profile. But you're then affecting the nature of the soil by using the auger in the first place. So yeah, that's a tricky one. And that's another reason why we're looking again at those third-year soil samples, because we did go deeper, but we couldn't always get 30 centimeters of soil. In some of the farms, it was really difficult to get down to that depth. So yeah, we want to have another look at that data.
Jimmy has highlighted the potential for cross-referencing to the recent plant life report, which is draft, I think, at the moment, that Isabel Tomlinson's been working on. I don't think it's been finally published, that relates to species richness and carbon sequestration, where they've been doing a literature review to kind of understand, and what they're finding from that is increased species richness is related to an increased soil carbon storage. And just how that is related to what you were finding.
Yeah, I am in touch with Isabel, and I have told her about those results. It's just because they're not quite published yet, she can't use them immediately. But yeah, she is aware, and she's aware that we picked up higher biodiversity in the PFLA samples as well. So yeah, hopefully we should be able to work with her on that. Yeah, I would say that Hannah's the results from SUSCAT are relevant to our study too, because two of the PFLA farms. So it gives us another nice angle in terms of holistic nature, because you're actually looking at the quality of the meat as well as the quality of everything else you're looking at. So that's cool. That's really nice to be able to kind of add that in. But I suppose I wanted to know, I know this is, it's very complex stuff and there's a lot of it. So what's the best way of packaging it up for people, the normal farmers that took part in the study, policy people? I mean, we are planning to do a film with some farmers in, but also with some of the results. Is that a good idea? How long should it be? I don't know. What else do you want? A brochure? We're planning to produce a brochure, leaflets. What's useful?
I definitely think films are useful, Lisa, and lots of folk will be able to find 10 minutes or so for a bit of YouTube viewing. And that said, you know, not having it too long. I think anything more than 15 minutes can become a bit too much to kind of cope with in a sitting, particularly when you're trying to learn a lot from it.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
yeah, we've definitely seen, I think you made reference to the mob grazing group in Scotland, and the tall grass grazing film has been really effective at kind of sharing that message.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that was my model.
Are you more likely to watch, sorry, just jumping in, are you more likely to watch like a short YouTube video or read a leaflet? Like if there was a hierarchy, what would the preference be?
I feel like we need a voting option. Is there a poll or something I could put out? It'd be interesting to know what people think.
I usually sometimes can do a poll,
Yeah.
but yeah.
How about sorry, I'm really sorry because I've missed most of your talk, Lisa. I'm an hour ahead and I was an hour behind in France. But anyway, how about if we do some meetings with the PFLA research group and we can go through, I mean, I haven't seen what you've just put to everybody else here, but you know, assuming that there is still a lot of detail that you want to bring out and examine, you know, how best to communicate it, then maybe the research group would be a good vehicle for doing that, and then collectively we can work out the best way to present it.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Thanks, Bill. Bill might be one of the stars of the film.
I thought that Bill's timing for arriving was perfect because, as you said, conservation grazing, Bill arrived into the knows Bill will know that that's what Bill does. So yeah, I thought that was. I just thought you'd planned that perfectly.
It was all really well choreographed.
Absolutely, Bill. Yeah, I definitely think that the research group in our next kind of operational meeting could maybe go through this, and you could present the PowerPoint, or if you're not able to come along, Lisa, to share that, and we can go through it as a group and identify the things that would be useful for sharing. And we have got some support to develop some infographics, so we can definitely do that around some of the key messages. And Sarah said about the press release when each paper is published targeted at farmers. And I think some blogs that could go onto the website, particularly those linked to biodiversity, would be great because they can go onto the new biodiversity pages on the PFLA website.
Yeah.
I was really interested, sorry, just to go back to the structural diversity, the vegetation height significantly higher in PFLA plots. I think this is a hugely important point, and you made it really early on in the presentation. Really fascinating. And I was talking to a farmer who I think was actually featured in your presentation about the potential for corncrake habitat on PFLA farms, because if they have higher vegetation than most other farms, does that mean that they are ideal for corncrake habitat development? And yeah, would be interested to know if there's a way of exploring that in more detail, and if there is a kind of project that we could think about in terms of, you know, if PFLA farms up and down the country have got this higher grass, could they be the basis for a corncrake project potentially?
I think the issue with the tall grass, and people say to me, "Oh, that doesn't," you know, it just depends when you look at it. But that which it does. But the thing is, it's notable because we look at CS grasslands all through the year, and there's such a lot of data that you do get an average picture of what's averagely out there most of the year. So I think it is a valid result, but I suppose if you're a corncrake, you're going to want to get your eggs laid and get the hell out of there before a mob of cattle come and stand on them. So I'd imagine there might be a bit of a conflict of interest there. It depends on how long your rest times are, I suppose, on the grass. But I imagine they might not be quite long enough, probably. But it's something we could look at.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would be really potentially quite interesting. Are there any other questions that anybody has? Either you can put in the chat or feel free to unmute.
No, that's good.
Okay, well, we're just gone 6 o'clock, so we are only meant to be doing an hour, and aware that we've taken up your time, Lisa, but thank you so much for coming. Disseminating.
I'm so sorry for dropping off.
No, it was great, and I love the
Oh.
way that Lawrence had pre-planned slides. He could just jump straight in. It was yeah.
So glad he came.
Hero.
Yeah. Thanks, Lawrence.
So yeah, nice to see you.
And it was great to see the outputs from the fuzzy cognitive mapping, which was a really exciting thing to be part of and to contribute to, and very interesting that the beef sector responses were very much highlighting things maybe out of their control and were kind of systemic issues, rather than the PFLA group was talking about on-farm soils, grass, vegetation, that sort of thing. I thought that was quite interesting to compare.
Yeah, there's a big question about perception, I think, as well, with that work. So yeah, it is interesting, and something that Lawrence is leading on, writing up that one. If anyone wants
Brilliant.
to pass him any great ideas.
Yeah, that was a good. Yeah, just made a mental note of that point, Nikki. That's really good. That's yeah, the external thing. It's quite interesting to see that. You know, for example, the regulations was one of the biggest blobs in the middle of that conventional fuzzy cognitive map, and yeah, climate change targets as well as another one, and then cost of feed. But yeah, they're all sort of external factors, as you say.
So I think we'll finish there. Thank you so much again for your input and for sharing all of this, Lisa, and the wider team as well. I would just say to attendees, if you have ideas that come to you at midnight and you think this would be a great thing for folk to research, or you want to know more about, then do drop me an email, nikki@pfla.org.uk, and I can pass that on to the relevant guys in the various research teams that we work with. And other than that, thanks again to everyone for coming along.
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay.
Thanks. Nice to see you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Good evening. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.